Hello and welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey. On this episode of the podcast, I speak with Justin Perry, a British Columbia Institute of Technology instructor who recently gave a talk at TedX Abbotsford titled Holistic Wildfire Management, Seeing Fire Through Multiple Lenses. In our discussion, he elaborates on ways in which we can change our perspective from a traditional approach of fighting every fire individually to shaping, cultivating, and adapting the landscape to a new set of conditions as climate change creates stronger and more deadly wildfires across Canada every summer and fall. Perry also explained how traditional Indigenous wildfire management methods can and have been adopted to combat fires, and speaks to several resources both for studying previous catastrophic fire events, such as the Lytton and Fort McMurray wildfires, and pointed to resource hubs for both individuals and businesses to increase fire resilience. Here's the interview.
Just advocating for a more holistic approach to wildfire management. And well, what does that mean? I think people hear the term holistic a lot and they think about new age and maybe abandoning the previous way things were done. And to me, that's not quite the definition of holistic. And as an example, in this circumstance, like, I'm not saying we don't need firefighters. We absolutely still need our wildland firefighting crews. They are certainly a key component of this. And it's the holistic wildfire management is just about assessing where can we make improvements to the way that we're currently doing things. And I think that, well, if we abandon some of the old ways completely of, as an example, managing our wildfires, we may find ourselves in more trouble into the future because we're not going to completely just ignore fire at this point in time. So it's about finding new ways to, I guess, innovate and improve upon to try and mitigate this crisis we're facing.
Now, our publications are focused on the construction industry. So what are some things construction can do that it isn't already doing to sort of mitigate or build resilience, because there are going to be fires and they're going to affect buildings?
So, I mean, in terms of new things, like, honestly, there's already been resources in existence, but people just may not be that aware that they exist. As an example, honestly, like, it's more on the simple side, but it's still absolutely proven to be effective. It's just Fire Smart, and they have an enormous amount of resources on their website about proper building material, and they've even come out with reports on, as an example, working with one of the natural disaster response agencies in Canada. Fire Smart has worked with them to come out with reports about both the Fort McMurray and the Lytton fire disasters, and those were both really great reports. I realize that Lytton is a very recent wound to our province, and the wound is still very fresh. It only happened a few years ago, but still, if people can stomach reading that report, there's some very good takeaways that can help people, whether if they're in community planning or just smaller level construction, smaller scale construction. There's still things in there that are very pertinent and relevant, I guess I could say.
Yeah, I was actually in Fort Mac about a couple months after the fires. We had to go for a different reason for work stuff, but you walk around and it's crazy. There's some lots that are gone and other ones right next to it that are fine. You see gas station signs that are melted and whole neighborhoods that are gone, but then other things are just working as they always have. It's very weirdly random. I'm sure you know this better than I do about how fire acts.
Well, we have both these reports that I just discussed. To tie into your point, both of them found that individual home properties were a major contributing factor as to whether homes survived in areas that were devastated by fire. So, as an example, if you have a metal roof or if you're using Fire Smart building material, like having a fire-resistant roof is the biggest contributing factor within construction material that determine whether or not a home will survive in a fire-devastated area. But at the same time, like, I'm sure everyone realizes, and I might be going on a very short tangent here, but
oh, that's fine. Go for it.
But like, we know that people's budgets are very tight right now, and not everyone can go out and just change the their roof, right, it can be a very expensive process.
Mhm.
So in some cases, it's easier to follow through with these recommendations into areas that are newly being developed. And as an
Mhm.
example, like Lytton is being rebuilt, and
Right.
they're able to follow all of those guidelines because,
Mhm.
well, maybe people have insurance money or whatever it happens to be. But just for like individual homeowners who may be reading this, if this quote is included as an example, just saying like, well, I don't have the money to swap out my roof.
Mhm.
FireSmart has other recommendations, like even clearing out some vegetation around your home will increase the likelihood that it survives if there is a wildfire.
Mhm. And you spoke in the speech about historic context. So maybe you could explain what that means and how that lends itself to understanding how to prevent wildfires now as opposed to how they were 100 years ago, let's say.
So there's a few different ways we could tackle this problem. I think I'll start by talking about two.
Mhm.
One is we know that climate change is very real. There's no denying it at this point. Again, it's a very fresh wound, so I don't know if this will get included in the interview or not. But the Lytton wildfire happened during the heat dome, and I'm not sure
Mhm.
if you were in BC
Oh
when we
yeah,
had
I'm in
that heat
Vancouver.
dome.
Yeah, yeah. So yes,
Yeah,
I was
so
there.
like 48 degrees in Lytton, the highest
Mhm.
recorded temperature ever in Canada,
Mhm.
happened like the day or 2 days before the fire. Combine that with rapid wind speeds, then it's just very good conditions for fire to spread. It's not good
Mhm.
for us as people, but
No.
fire spread likes those conditions, right?
Mhm.
So climate change is very much affecting weather and climate. So that's one way in that I guess we can't look at historical norms.
Right.
And I'm sure you've seen it in terms of
Mhm.
like building codes, whether it's for
Yeah, oh yeah.
bridges
Yeah.
or homes, is
Mhm.
changing to
Mhm.
because like as an example, I'm not very big in the construction industry, but
Mhm.
I know bridges like oftentimes are built for what is it like 100-year
Yeah.
disasters,
Yeah.
something like
Mhm.
that.
You're right. When the floods happened, there was a
Ex-
whole rethink about it for that very reason. These things were
yeah,
built 50, 60 years ago when this was not the conditions they were
yeah,
faced against, and now it is. So the rebuilds take that into
yeah.
account, right?
So we can't look at weather and climate in the same lens.
Mhm.
So again, like three factors to that influence fire behavior. We have
Mhm.
fuel, weather, and topography. And I mean, I think this is part of the reason why we're having this discussion because in an urban environment, the fuel is a lot of the time building material.
Mhm.
So I'll come back to the other historical lens in a minute here.
Sure.
But
Sure.
as an example with Lytton, fire started. It was a grass fire. It
Mhm.
spread along the surface of the ground, and then it reached the community and then spread building from building. So
Mhm.
we
Mhm.
need context because like people may think, well, is it a crown fire? Is it trees that started this? And Lytton's one example of, well, it was just one fire that
Mhm.
reached the town, and then there was no other vegetation influence beyond this. It was just
Mhm.
building to building. So
Mhm.
we have to be able to manage our fuel in that way. And again, look at like the context of where each location is in the province, because
Mhm.
there's going to be different strategies depending on where you are.
That was another thing you mentioned to talk about fuel management, I think in the context of vegetation. So maybe you could explain what that means and how we can sort of manage or change what we're doing already to make that better.
So there's a few different things we could talk about here. One is like at the construction level again is
Mhm.
like I'm sure you're well aware that there are wildfire development permit areas, right?
Mhm.
So when
Mhm.
you're building in certain areas that are prone to wildfire, they mandate having a metal roof or certain building materials, stuff like that. So there are already things in existence for new developments, but again, it's difficult because we're in whether you want to you could debate this, but our economy is pretty slow right now. People
Mhm.
don't have a lot of money to go
Right.
out and make massive renovations to
Mhm.
their homes, right? So, in terms of fuel management, yes, the construction material is important, but in terms of vegetation treatment, it would be just simply reducing
Mhm.
or modifying the vegetation that you have around your house.
Okay.
So, in terms of removal, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory.
Mhm.
Removing vegetation that um, is adjacent to your property and things like
Right.
this. And in terms of modification, there are a few other strategies that are a little bit more sophisticated. Like maybe we allow for more deciduous tree species in cut blocks that are closer to communities.
Mhm.
And maybe we still absolutely need like shrubs and pollinators and deciduous trees around our homes because those contribute shade, and we don't want to get rid of
Mhm.
all vegetation because then things are just going to dry out.
Mhm.
So I
And
guess it
carbon
would
wise, it
be,
eliminates carbon from the atmosphere as well. So yeah.
yeah. So in terms of vegetation would be, I guess, being more smart about the types of vegetation
Mhm.
that are allowed or even being recommended. And there's a few things I could say about this. There are a few nurseries across Canada that have plants that are certified fire smart. So
Okay.
if you're unsure, you could go and look these up. And Fire Smart even has a list of recommended
Mhm.
landscaping vegetation. Another example I could give, and I know I'm jumping around here a little
Oh,
bit
that's
and
okay.
probably going quick, but as an example, like Squamish, we have my hometown, by the way,
Mhm.
Squamish in our wildfire development permit area. You're not allowed to plant cedar shrubs anymore just
Mhm.
because they dry out and they are basically like
Kindling.
tinder. It's just reducing vegetation and understanding the attributes that we can modify, whether
Mhm.
it's using less coniferous trees and more deciduous trees, and then managing the forest beyond just where it meets the urban interface.
Mhm. What's your background in this? How did you get interested in advocating is not the right word, but sort of trying to solve this problem?
Well, I mean, like I am a forestry graduate of
Mhm. Mhm.
BCIT,
Yeah.
and immediately after graduating, my direct work after graduating was very much tied into mapping out wildfires with
Mhm.
infrared cameras.
Okay.
So having that background, I took the reins in teaching the fire components in the forestry program, and then also just seeing where we can make improvements on.
Mhm.
I'm a member of Métis Nation of BC. And
Mhm.
as an example, when I was a student at BCIT, we had a sweat lodge, and it's traditional Indigenous ceremony. May not
Mhm.
have been used by Coast Salish people, but some different nations across North America had sweat lodges. And anyways, fire is an integral part of that
Right. Of
ceremony.
course.
And
Yeah.
from a
Mhm.
cultural lens, this is international too.
Mhm.
Fire is often seen as like something that can be healing or cleansing. So
Mhm.
understanding that, I guess, the context, the conditions of fire for in are very interesting to me
Mhm.
because again, like my elders taught me about some of
Mhm.
the cultural and um healing powers of fire, and
Mhm.
we can apply the exact same thing in the landscape if we're careful.
Mhm. That's kind of more of the holistic thing you were talking about, bringing in those perspectives that don't normally get brought in. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, hopefully that was helpful.
Oh, it was very helpful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. This is working closer with First Nations communities. And as an example, First Nations Emergency Services Society, like Finesse, just got a pretty sizable grant to train First Nations fire crews across the province, and they've already actively been doing this.
Mhm.
So there
Okay.
are levels of government that are supporting this. And like, I really just want to see it accelerate, and like I'm advocating for this because like I see that I can make a difference through like being able to talk about it adeptly, that I
Mhm.
can help people understand that there is a case for reintroducing fire back into the landscape.
Mhm. And it's certainly going to be something we're going to be talking about in the next few months, I'm sure, because I think it's predicted that it's going to be just as bad as it was last year, if not worse.
I mean, we can't like anticipate climate 100%, but
No,
what I
but
can say is like from my own experience, like here in Squamish, we had 1 day of snow. We've had barely any rain,
mhm.
and it's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
middle of February. So if you look at the current conditions, and yes, we can look at long-term climate, like we have to, I guess, brace for the worst
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
be more proactive when we do have these windows when it can be proper to burn or go out and do vegetation treatments.
Now we talked about the people adopting some of this stuff. Have you run into any pushback, or is it pretty much everybody
Certainly.
agrees? Okay, let's
No,
go for
no,
it.
no,
Let's.
no, certainly. As an example, the resort municipality of Whistler is
Mhm,
one of the few communities who could actually afford to follow through and do wide scale fuel
mhm,
management, vegetation treatment um, practices in their community. And you get little, I guess, pockets of criticism, which is fine. Like, we want to
mhm,
always assess if we can do things better, but you have people out there who think that even if you're removing ladder fuels and some small unhealthy trees, they think you're killing the forest.
mhm,
And really, there's no middle ground or room for discussion with someone who's so set in their ways. And
mhm.
like, part of what I'm trying to do is like very concisely educate people about the history and say that there is a use case if we do it well. But absolutely, there's pushback from people about thinking that we're killing the forest or
Mhm.
hurting nature or that we're implementing smoke into the atmosphere, which we are. But again, it's like, when do you want your smoke and how abundant do you want it?
Mhm.
Because it's inevitable at this point. So we want to try and have it under favorable conditions. But
Mhm.
even if you're trying to do it under favorable conditions, then people will ask you why you're doing that because they don't understand that, well, we're just trying to reduce the severity of future fires
I mean,
for that given location.
don't fire crews do that already with prescribed burns? I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding what they're doing, but isn't that kind of the same process?
Well, yes, BC Wildfire is doing this, but
Hmm.
it might be worth talking about. Like, there's a difference between prescribed and cultural burning. Like,
Okay.
if we want to lump those together
Hmm.
for now, they're not identical, but let's lump
Okay.
those together. So
Sure.
if we have prescribed and cultural burning versus a back burn,
Hmm.
those are two very different things. A backburn is basically only done in an emergency or
Right.
when there's a full active crown fire. And when you don't have many options, like if you have a fire rapidly approaching a town,
Hmm.
then you might have to consider a backburn to clear the vegetation pockets ahead of the spreading
So,
fire. But
so
you
okay,
might
gotcha.
get
Yeah.
you might get a shift in the wind. That is a serious gamble. And
Hmm.
of course, whether it's a backburn or prescribed and cultural burning, there is risks. There are
Hmm.
certainly risks. And I mean, there have been circumstances where there have been backburns and then the wind has shifted and it's spread into a community. But
Hmm.
in those scenarios, it's very likely that the larger spreading fire would have done that already. And
Right.
I'm not at
Exactly.
all trying to take away, like, people shouldn't be upset that they lost their homes because some
Hmm.
people have. And it's very serious. But in terms of the difference between a backburn and prescribed or cultural burning, it's like,
Hmm.
instead of it being a last minute thing where we're at the
Hmm.
mercy of the wind, like sometimes years or even a decade can go into planning, getting the permits, waiting for
Right.
the
Right.
proper
Right.
venting conditions
Hmm.
and relative humidity. There's a few more things I could say very quickly if we can talk about the
Hmm. Yeah.
history, because there was one
Yeah.
more
Go for
point I
it,
wanted
please.
to make
Yeah. Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
Speaking of history, we know that in BC we had a policy of exclusive fire suppression. So we
Hmm.
put out nearly every fire that we could for 100 years.
Hmm.
So that has created problems because we have eliminated fire from the landscape. And then those fires that would have come in and burned off these landscapes and would have had less severe fires have created a buildup of fuel. Now there's climate change and there's conditions for disastrous fires to happen.
Hmm.
That's a little bit of the history. So there's two things I could say about that.
Sure.
One
Go for
is
it.
our policy of exclusive fire suppression has created a buildup of fuel across the province. And BC Wildfire is trying to change things. And as an
Hmm.
example, they have a modified fire response now where they just monitor the fire and try to let it burn for ecological benefit. And if it
Hmm.
gets close to a community or it's starting to spread too intensely, obviously they put it out. But BC Wildfire Service is like, they already do have response types
Hmm.
that help mimic natural fire.
Right. Okay.
And there is a lot more history about fire suppression in BC that we could talk about, but people are interested. Like, I go into that in quite a bit of detail in my TED Talk.
Right. Okay.
The other resource that I could recommend is prescribedfire.ca.
Okay.
So prescribedfire.ca was made in conjunction with FireSmart and some First Nations fire keepers across the province. And it goes into the benefits of cultural burning and prescribed fire, and some really great interviews with fire keepers in the interior. And also the other resource is just firesmart.ca. Like if homeowners or builders want to read more, it's like firesmartbc.ca has a lot of great resources.
And that's it for this episode of the Construction Record Podcast. You can hear us on Spotify, Apple Music, and Amazon Music, as well as on the Journal of Commerce and Daily Commercial News websites and the constructionrecord.libsyn.com. Thanks for listening.